Good evening, everyone. My name is Amanda Thomas, and I would love to welcome you to Science on Tap. We are here tonight to talk about the gut-immune connection and how it affects the brain with Dr. Emmerin Meyer. And first, I'd like to say a quick thank you to the Society for Neuroscience, the Oregon and Southwest Washington chapter. They are having their annual conference next week, and they were the ones who put me in touch with Dr. Meyer and are sponsoring this event. So thank you to the Society for Neuroscience. About our speaker this evening, Dr. Emmerin Meyer is a distinguished research professor of medicine and the director of the G. Oppenheimer Center for Neurobiology of Stress and Resilience at UCLA. His clinical research focus is on brain-gut interactions, and he's an expert on brain/gut microbiome interactions in health and disease. He's also the author of a couple of books, and let me get to my next slide. The first one is The Mind-Gut Connection, which is out in paperback, and then The Gut-Immune Connection, which is what he's largely going to be talking about this evening. That is coming out on, I believe, June 8th of this year. So it's not out yet, but it will be soon. And if you are interested in either or both of those books, I encourage you to go to Broadway Books. You can see the link there, and they will offer you a 15% discount on both of those books or either of those books if you purchase before May 4th and use the code STMeyer15, and our volunteers will be putting information on that in the chat. So next, I know that we have a lot of new people here because we have a lot of registrations, and we're very glad you're all here. I know that many of you may not know about Science on Tap, so just a brief intro. We are an event series that's hosted in Portland, Oregon, and in the before times, you can see one of our photos from an event that we were hosting in a theater here in town. And our goal was to make science accessible, fun, and meaningful for adults in particular. So we'd go to a theater, have a pint, and talk about science. Since the pandemic, we have moved our events online, and I believe that this is the 31st event that we have done online since April of last year. So we've been trying to do a lot of them to keep everybody's minds engaged and keep talking about science. And I want to say a thank you to these 28 folks in particular. These are our Patreon supporters. We have many more than this, but these folks in particular have been supporting us since April of last year. So they've been supporting us on Patreon for a full year. So thank you to these folks. We could not do this without you. And if you're interested in joining us on Patreon, we can send you, we'll post information in the chat on how to do that. Also, if you are interested in seeing any of those 31 past events or checking out episodes of our podcast, which is called Scientist Walks Into a Bar, you can check out our YouTube channel at Science on Tap ORWA. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and welcome our speaker to the stage, and welcome Dr. Emmerin Meyer.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda, for this kind introduction. And I'd also like to thank Larry Sherman from the Oregon and Washington chapter of the Society for Neuroscience. It's really an honor to have been invited to give this presentation, particularly because the Society of Neuroscience is the society has played a big role, and still does in my work and in my career. So I should also preface that I'm actually talking to you from a hotel room in a nice small town in Colorado, and after a beautiful day of skiing. If anything doesn't look perfect, it's the hotel room and the improvisation of setting up the light and everything. So Amanda asked me to say a few words. How did I get to my current position, my current interest? So I was actually supposed to take over the family business of my parents, sixth generation of confectioners in southern Germany, in Bavaria. And to the big disappointment of my dad, I decided really in the last minute to accept an invitation to go to the medical school in Munich and just start a career, which I think was based on, I have to admit, I've always had the interest in the business aspect. So this came from an upbringing in a very successful business. But I have to say that my passion for science, scientific experiments and scientific explanations has been stronger, and I'm glad I stuck with that gut feeling all the way to where I am today. So let me go to the. So just as a disclosure, none of these companies are actually supporting any of my research or anything that I'm presenting to you today. They are all working in the microbiome space, though. So let me start with 2016. In the middle, you see, the mind-gut connection. This really was a book that summarized a lot of experiences that I've had, personal experiences that I've had that brought me to the point of getting interested in first the brain-gut communication, which has been my career-long interest, and later in the last 10 years in the brain-gut microbiome interactions. And this book touched on a lot of topics that I normally would not talk to my colleagues about or give presentations at scientific meetings. And from microbe speak, gut reactions, gut feelings, emotions, early memories, and then a couple of things related to diet, the North American diet or the standard American diet, and the Mediterranean diet. So many of these interests stayed with me to this year when my second book will come out, particularly this concept of optimal health. But it's taking it to a much higher stage. And it also, a lot of things have happened in these almost 5 years now that have continued this revolutionary development of this particular part of brain science. I'll be touching on actually a wide variety of topics. So give you a brief brain-gut microbiome system 101 that will include communication channels between the gut and the brain, then how the brain-gut microbiome system responds to dietary and psychological stress or perturbations, the role of altered gut immune interactions in our current chronic disease epidemic, and in my opinion, a simple way to fix the problem through a gut microbiome friendly diet. So hopefully we'll have the time to go through all these. Each of those topics could be a separate talk, but I hope I can weave them together in a form that shows you sort of this fascinating interconnectedness. This is a figure that I used in my first book, and I think it's still up to date. I've added a couple of things to it. It's essentially a concept, a systems view of the interactions of our brain, our central nervous system, our gut, the microbiome, but not that in isolation, but also in interactions with the environment in the form of soil microbiome, water, air. And like any systems, like any complex technical system, the homeostatic state that a system is in can be disturbed or perturbed by stressors. And there's two stressors. It's kind of fascinating that both in some ways involve the gut microbiome. The psychosocial stressors that we all, automatically think about when you talk about stress. But there's also something that I call dietary stress, which is the onslaught of the standard American diet on this system that has evolved over millions of years and has never seen anything like that rapid, last 75 years, rapid change to a dietary pattern, as I said, that's never existed before in human history. When we talk about the microbiome, and I mentioned this initially, that my whole career I've spent on studying the interactions between the brain and the gut. And we thought some 10 years ago that we pretty much knew everything to explain even common diseases like irritable bowel syndrome or other diseases that involve both the mind and the gut. But then, the microbiome came on the scene, and particularly some revolutionary experiments about how the microbiome in our gut can communicate with the brain. So if we start out what we knew when I was in medical school, what microbes do, they break down complex carbohydrates like resistant starch into short chain fatty acids. A lot of people have heard this term in the lay media. That breaks down components of plants into estrogen-like molecules that can be absorbed, like for example from tofu has a high concentration of these, that can break down medications or other foreign substances, chemicals that the gut microbes have never seen in their existence, but they have the ability to break them down into smaller metabolites. Also to break down proteins into amines and phenols through fermentation. So we knew that, but it seemed to be something that really is an activity that is really limited to the gut. Then a series of studies, really provocative studies done first time in rats and then in mice, were published, hard to believe really in the beginning, that indicated that some of these microbes also can communicate with the brain, as sort of shown here in this cartoon. And in the meantime, we know that it's not just the brain that is a target of signals generated by the microbes, but also our immune system, our cardiovascular system, the nervous system that we have in our gut, the enteric nervous system, and metabolism. So while some of these earlier concepts are still of interest to understand what these signals are, this has really taken center stage. What do all these signals that go throughout the body generate in the gut by organisms that we can't see, but that nevertheless, have a biomass that's comparable to the liver and have a number of a vast number of genes that make them allow them to produce a vast amount of chemical signaling molecules. So if you compare the genes, our human genes, about 20,000, with the 2 to 20 million microbial genes, you sort of see that amazing ratio. And graphically, it's illustrated here. So the red contour of this body are the human genes, and all the rest would be determined by the microbial genes. And the things that I find always amazing, that all our textbooks are written without taking these 20 million microbial genes into account. Another thing which is amazing, that most of these genes, we don't know their function yet, even though we already learned a lot about the few genes that have been isolated and characterized. And then in our disease models, we neglect 99% of that system. Together, the microbial genes and the human genes have been referred to as a holobiont, because they really work together as a unified organism. And I'll give you many examples to illustrate that close interconnectedness. So the more scientific version, and you'll hear me use this term systems a lot, because this, I think, in my opinion, is the only way to really understand and conceptualize these interactions of billions and trillions of cells in our nervous system and in our gut and in the microbiome. So the gut communicates, all these three players communicate with each other in a bidirectional way. Many people refer to this as the brain-gut axis, and I used to use that term as well. But that's really a misnomer, because an axis would be a linear communication from one organ to the other. This is everything that is communicated from one site to the brain will trigger a signal or communication in the other direction, setting up feedback loops, oscillations, and a nonlinear behavior that we can't really understand with sort of the simplistic, reductionistic models that we have been able to use to study. Many have had great breakthroughs in biology, but they don't really apply well to understand this system. And so the communication happens between these three players, between the brain connectome, which means a number of circuits in the brain of interconnected nerve cells, the gut connectome. The gut, even though we have focused really on its digestive function and absorption and secretion, in reality, it's the seat of the greatest number of immune cells in our body, the greatest number of nerve cells in our body outside the central nervous system, and the greatest number of endocrine cells outside, our main endocrine organs. These three cell types interact with other cells like epithelial cells, glial cells, and in my opinion, you can only understand that function if you look at the bidirectional interactions between these players. So we have these two main players. They communicate with each other in neuronal, immune, and what's called neuroendocrine or hormonal pathways from the bottom up. And the brain has, through the autonomic nervous system, a way to talking back to the gut, changing the contractions, peristaltic reflex, secretion, the permeability, but also the microbiome. Then the same kind of bidirectional communication happens between the gut and the microbes. The gut produces molecules that talk to the microbes and vice versa. And then the microbes can have so-called neuroactive metabolites that they can use directly to talk to the brain. And the brain has ways through the autonomic nervous system to influence the behavior and gene expression of many microbes. But the microbes can also talk to the brain indirectly through the gut and the gut's immune system, generating immune mediators that can influence the brain. So in a few words, this is what I'll be talking about throughout this talk, this complex communication system between these three main players. I would say, even though I'm a gastroenterologist, without bias or exaggeration, this system is probably the most important homeostatic system within our bodies because it links us closely through the brain with the outside world, through the gut connectome with another aspect of the outside world in terms of our food and the diet and the environment, and with the microbes that are trillions of organisms that sort of have their own rules of engagement and communication. So the gut microbiome, still part of some of the general explanations, the gut microbiome is not sort of a static thing that we have from the time we're born to the time we die, but it's highly dynamic over the lifespan. Different organisms dominate in the gut from birth to infancy to adolescence and adulthood, and then into the old age. At each of these stages, there's a change in the main players shown here. So you see different microorganisms that dominate the microbiome at these different stages. And we also know there's, since these microbes talk to the brain, there is a development over the lifespan of this communication system from the microbes to the brain. Major influences in this development are early in life, the first 1,000 days in life, starting before delivery. So, for example, serious illness of the mother, medications of the mother, maternal stress, very interesting aspect that maternal stress can through the mother's microbiome affect the development of the infant. But also once the infant is born, the exposure to medications, particularly antibiotics, massive doses of antibiotics before the age of 2. And then once the baby is delivered, breast milk versus formula feeding, the mode of delivery. So there's many factors in these first 1,000 days of life, starting before delivery, that shape the development of this individual microbiome that we then have throughout our life, which is still modulated. So in adulthood, medications continue to be a major modulator of this system. Diet takes on a major role, and I'll come back to this as a major focus of my talk. But also the brain. So the stress and emotions that the brain generates have a mirror image at the gut level and at the gut microbiome level. So we have distinct things that happen early in life that shape this first part. And then we have a series of influences that continue to shape the composition and the function of the gut microbiome. So let me say a few things about this gut microbiome to body signaling via the immune system. So here is sort of a schematic of the metabolites that are being generated by both the host, meaning us, but also by the microbes. We understand now for a lot of these metabolites, which ones come from the microbes and which ones come from us. They are influenced to a great degree by what we eat, because and I'll come back to this in a minute, but a major source of these metabolites are the breakdown products of these various food components. And these metabolites and other signaling molecules signal to us, to the body, via the immune system, first through the gut-associated immune system, but then throughout the body. It's just put one arrow here to the brain. But the immune system really amplifies these signals and spreads them throughout our entire body to all our organ systems. Looking a little bit closer at these metabolites. So you can sort of identify 3 types of metabolites. Some, as I mentioned already, are these diet-derived ones. So the amino acids that we consume with our food are transformed by microbial enzymes into neurotransmitters, often very similar to the neurotransmitters that our nervous system produces, into neuroactive metabolites, such as the indoles. We'll come back to these, or phenols, all of which have influences on brain function and structure. There's also what's called here the polysaccharides. These are these complex carbohydrates that make up dietary fiber. So any unprocessed plant-based food is full of these complex carbohydrates, which are transformed or metabolized into short-chain fatty acids. And that's sort of a currency for beneficial functions that are mediated through the microbiome that affect not only the immune system, but also other bodily functions. And then there's also these polyphenols, another component of a plant-based diet, very large molecules, often called by this misnomer antioxidants based on their effects on isolated cells in test tubes. But these cannot be absorbed, just like these complex carbohydrates cannot be absorbed in the gut, but they first have to be transformed or metabolized into smaller compounds, like simple phenol molecules, and for example, the estrogens. So phytoestrogens in plants, in soy products, become estrogens once they're metabolized. So and then there's other very interesting stories, and I don't have the time to touch on those. Our bile acids, when we normally talk about just the bile acids that we need to absorb and digest the fat part of our food. They are being transformed by a different class of microbes into what's called secondary bile acids. They're secreted into our gut from the gallbladder. Microbes break them down into and change their configuration. They are being reabsorbed, and they have major effects on various organ functions, including our brain. And the same thing is true, for example, of estrogens, our own estrogens, not the phytoestrogens I mentioned that we get from plants, but the estrogens that are synthesized in the ovaries, for example. They are also secreted into the intestine, are metabolized there, are being reabsorbed. And depending on what microbes you have in your gut, it will result in different levels of estrogens based on what the microbes contribute to it. And there are these what's called biosynthetic precursors. Just a simple thing, simple word. The membrane components of microbes contain what's called these microorganism-associated molecular patterns, or MAMPs, which can activate receptors in the gut, but also in the nervous system that activate the immune system. So we've learned a lot about what happens when both external, food and internal substances are further processed by microbes. And we're beginning to understand what role these products play in health and in disease. So essentially what happens here, what the microbes do, they transform metabolic input from our diet into microbial signals. So it goes from metabolism to communication and computation, sort of what the microbes are able to do. One way that signals like these metabolites are communicating with the brain, so this is a rat brain, and this is the gut. So for example, breakdown products of tryptophan, like these indoles, they can act on vagal nerve fibers, which then carry the signal to the brain. There's many other pathways, immune signals, and many other metabolites that you choose this route via the vagus nerve. If you cut the vagus nerve in this animal, it will no longer have this communication. And depending on the defects that happen, you then know what they contributed, what this communication contributed to health and behavior of this animal in the first place. Another key player in this gut-to-brain communication are these ECCs, or enterochromaffin cells. These are endocrine-like cells. So this is the gut lining. These are endocrine-like cells that have these little microvilli with many receptors on them. And certain microbes generate, we talked about the secondary bile acids, we talked about the amino acid metabolites like indole, talked about the short-chain fatty acids. They act on these receptors of these cells. And what's the most interesting is what's in these cells is serotonin. And these microbial signals can lead to the release of serotonin, most of which does not get into the bloodstream and is carried to the brain, but most of which act on these vagal sensory nerve terminals and send signals to the brain. And we will come back to this later. Another cousins of these cells contain the hormones in our gut that regulate satiety after you eat a delicious meal that you don't want to continue eating, or if you're hungry and craving for food. Different types of hormones stored in similar kind of cells are modulated in a similar way by microbial signals, generating then signals that reach either these systemic circulation, which is true for many of these appetite regulating molecules, but also go at the same time through the vagus nerve. So let me tell you a couple of things about this generation of signaling molecules from amino acids. It's one of the most well-characterized stories of this communication. And I'll walk you through this briefly. So tryptophan, a essential amino acid that we also get in many foods that we like, including chocolate and cheese, amongst others. It is metabolized by specialized microbes in our gut, like called these spore-forming Clostridiales. I don't need to remember the name. But these organisms stimulate these enterochromaffin cells through short-chain fatty acids and secondary bile acids. They stimulate an enzyme in these cells that converts tryptophan into serotonin. These cells also turn out not just be able to be the factory for serotonin, but also the warehouses. So 85 to 90% of all our serotonin that we have as humans is stored in these cells. And that's interesting because these cells form synaptic connections with these vagal pathways that then, when serotonin is released, activate these vagal sensory nerves, which go directly into the brainstem regions and the limbic regions within the brain that regulate emotional function and many other vital functions. The brain also, and as I said at the beginning, can talk back down to these cells and stimulate the release of serotonin. So 5-HT is an abbreviation for serotonin, which then is released, comes in contact with microbes. And some of these microbes have the same molecule that in our modern pharmacotherapy we target with antidepressants, with serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So when you take Prozac or any of the other serotonin reuptake inhibitors, you can block the uptake by microbes of this released serotonin. We don't know yet what function, what consequences this has. But like any aspect of the system, it's always the bidirectional communication. The microbes stimulate the production, serotonin then modulates the microbes, release serotonin, affects the brain, and the brain talks back to these serotonin-containing cells. This seems complicated enough, but actually there's a lot more that happens. Actually, the majority of tryptophan is metabolized into another molecule called kynurenine, which is also modulated. The production of this molecule modulated by gut microbes. And it's been shown so that lactobacilli produce this hydrogen peroxide that can inhibit the transformation of tryptophan to kynurenine. So the more lactobacilli in animal models there are, the more inhibition, the more this metabolism is shifted towards the tryptophan serotonin metabolism. And finally, there's a third one, the indoles. The indoles are also produced from tryptophan, but in contrast to these other two pathways, the microbes don't play a modulatory role. They're the only ones that can actually produce it because they have an enzyme. Only the microbes have an enzyme that can make this transformation. Without paying much attention to the details of the biochemistry, an important molecule that's being generated in this metabolism of indole is a substance called indoxyl sulfate, which has now been identified as has both good and bad effects on our biology, but it has been identified as a major player, for example, in autism spectrum disorders and in Parkinson's and in cognitive decline. So this just gives you an example of one simple amino acid that is dependent. What happens with that molecule when you eat your your chocolate, what happens to this molecule is dependent on very complex systems of microbes that do different things and that are influenced by, for example, how much tryptophan you ingest. The more you get this mechanism, how stressed you are, the fewer lactobacilli you have, and the more kynurenine you produce, which is bad for brain function and nerve function. And also this ratio of how many indoles are being produced that ultimately generate this indoxyl sulfate molecule. So besides generating these neuroactive molecules that we've learned a lot about these mechanisms that can explain how microbes and interactions with, for example, with diet or with stress can influence gut function, brain function. There's also these interactions, the gut microbiome with the immune system. And everybody probably has heard this term leaky gut. This has sort of become a household name and can open a magazine or some publication geared to the lay public that doesn't mention that. So let me just briefly explain to that, which has become sort of a central element of our understanding how microbes play a role in abnormal immune activation. So with a healthy diet, we have a highly diverse, very rich population of microbes, consists of many species and families that interact like an ecosystem and produce many of these substances and pathways that I've shown you before. These microbes, trillions of them, are isolated from the layer of the gut that's just a few 10 microns underneath that. And that is crucial because the lining of our gut has these dendritic cells in it that have little tentacles that stick out into the mucus layer and constantly monitor, are there microbes, are there invaders in the mucus layer that might come close enough to the gut to affect actually the immune system, the biggest part of our immune system that's, again, just microns underneath this epithelial barrier. So the thick mucus layer, the tight gut barrier of epithelial cells, and these sentinels that monitor to make sure that no microbes come actually close to the immune system. This is an intact gut barrier, the key feature of a healthy gut. What happens in the majority of Americans, unfortunately, that are on the standard American diet, or I should say this here, we'll come back to this point, are under chronic stress, very similar processes, even though they sound very different. You get a decrease in the diversity and the richness of these microbes, including a decrease in those microbes that are responsible for generating this mucus layer. So now you have microbes in this mucus layer. They come in touch with these sensors of the dendritic cells. The dendritic cells report that to the complex immune cells within the gut-associated immune system. And so even just the signaling, the activation of dendritic cells will lead to the generation of inflammatory mediators in the systemic circulation. But once this has happened and there's a loss of this tight epithelial barrier, so decrease in the gut barrier, there's now the ability of microbes to actually go directly to make contact with the immune cells. And with these membrane-contained molecules that microbes have, I mentioned earlier, these what's called MAMPs, they can activate receptors on certain immune cells, which will then lead to a full-blown immune activation, systemic immune activation. And in analogy to the endotoxemia that people have in response to an uncontrolled infection, this is something that happens without any um, infectious process, simply in response to all changes in our diet, with or without this combination with chronic stress. And this metabolic endotoxemia goes into the systemic circulation and reaches all our organs, including the brain, because it can overcome the blood-brain barrier. And depending on the genetic predisposition of an individual, can become major risk factors for a variety of chronic diseases. I will come back to this, ranging from depression to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease to colon cancer, cognitive decline, Parkinson's disease, and metabolic syndrome. About 40% of adults in the US population suffer from metabolic syndrome, a combination of high blood pressure, diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and increased lipids in your blood. And all of these interact with each other to produce something which, I like to call the epidemic of non-infectious diseases that have been in increasingly during the last 75 years. So this whole immune pathway occurs in addition to these other complex interactions that I talked to you about, of neuroactive molecules that can reach the nervous system and other organs directly without the immune system. So a deadly combination of this with the others contributes to this massive increase, continuing increase in our chronic disease population. And just as an illustration, so there's many examples in biology. There's always a yin and yang. There's beneficial effects of the gut microbiome on, for example, on a series of cells within the brain, and there's detrimental ones. So detrimental ones, we talked about the neurotransmitters, these cell wall components, these MAMPs of microbes that can make contact with the immune cells. But you see pretty much the same players here. Here is the effects that they have on the brain from neurodegeneration, inflammation. Inflammation comes up in almost all of them as part of this systemic immune activation. But then we also have the positive effects. So I would say this is what you get with an unhealthy diet and in a chronic stress situation with an unhealthy lifestyle. Here are the things that are positive. And again, you see a lot of things that are shared in these mechanisms. The short chain fatty acids, certain neurotransmitters with positive effects, bile acids, estrogen metabolites, tryptophan metabolites, and the polyphenols, a very important group. So in some ways you could say it's a fairly simple system that uses inflammation or this metabolic toxemia as a major factor in negatively influencing various cell types that have different roles in our brain. And then you have, with a healthy diet, you have very similar substances like polyphenols and short chain fatty acids that are contained, and we'll come back to this in a mainly plant-based diet. So let me tell you what happened, and this is a big part of the gut immune book. There have been dramatic changes in the last 75 years since World War II in our lifestyles, particularly in diet, increase in chronic stress levels, the early programming of a gut microbiome that I explained to you in medical practices, from vaccinations to mainly the antibiotics. So I'm definitely not an anti-vaxxer, but I am against the excessive inappropriate use of antibiotics in the hospital settings. They have resulted in a state of dysbiosis, which essentially means a change in the composition, decreased diversity, decreased richness, extinction of several microbial taxa, supposedly, according to some authors, scientists, an irreversible extinction, and the effect that these influences via the gut microbiota have had on our gut. Our gut responds, as we have seen, to these changes in the gut microbiome with the immune activation, with a variety of immune cells being activated that underlie this, systemic metabolic toxemia. And this effect, this systemic immune activation, will affect all our organs. And the fact, so when I wrote the book, it's kind of remarkable. You don't really learn this in medical school, or you're not being taught this in major medical meetings, that all of these diseases have shown this continuous increase, some faster than others, in not just in the US, but also in developing countries, and most worrisome in younger and younger age groups. So rather, for give you one example, colon cancer, rather than really understanding why this is happening and tackling the problem at its origin and at its microbial cause, the gastroenterological associations are recommending earlier and earlier screening of people, so that in 20 years from now, maybe screening adolescents for colon cancer, without really asking why is all this happening. So I've come to this conclusion, just really going through the literature for this book, that gut health, and this is really the health of this whole gut connectome, including and particularly of its immune system. And we talked about all these components with permeability, the different types of immune cells, the different types of nerve cells, and how they all interact. So the health of that system plays a major role in increasing the risk and accelerating the progression in all these diseases. And what's interesting, that immune pathways play a role in all of these in response to what happens in the gut. And also what's intriguing, that all these chronic diseases are interrelated to each other. So the prevalence of depression has gone up, of Alzheimer's goes up, of autism spectrum disorders has increased tremendously. Metabolic syndrome has increased tremendously, obesity. So all of these have increased. The reason that not more people are talking about it is, surprisingly, the mortality from these diseases has not increased uncontrolled. And that's because the medical system has launched a massive intervention not to cure these diseases, but to attenuate the consequences and to prevent people from dying. So we have a continually increased morbidity of all these diseases, but either stable or decreasing mortality. So hopefully we will have, there will be more attention to this topic, because I think it is progressing under the radar almost, and certainly is not being addressed by the medical system. And I should say, the pharmaceutical industry obviously has done a phenomenal job in preventing death, excessive death from these diseases. But on the other hand, it's also a continuous revenue source of revenue for them, because if you open the TV in the evening hours and see these commercials, never-ending commercials for a lot of medications that are targeted at these abnormal immune activations that underlie these diseases. So I have about 10 more minutes. So I come back to this concept, we've talked about this now a lot, that any system, any technical system, technological, computer-based system, has a property that when it's perturbed by stress, it will respond in an adaptive way, will change all its connections and pathways up to a certain point at which point, it becomes maladaptive. So the consequences of adapting to continuous and increasing stressors becomes maladaptive and actually becomes the cause of disease itself. So we've seen this slide before. Here are the things a healthy diet is associated with all these features: high number of complex carbohydrates, high fiber degradation, high diversity, high abundance of microorganisms that stimulate this mucus production, and high abundance of certain taxa amongst the microbes. And then standard American diet, excessive amounts of refined carbohydrates, in particular sugar, high fat, mainly from animal sources, low fiber, progressively decreasing gut microbiome diversity, decreased abundance of these mucus stimulating microbes, and a decreased abundance of these Prevotella. If you compare the few remnants of prehistoric societies that live in just a few thousand of these people left on the Amazon or on the Orinoco or in the Rift Valley in East Africa, they have very high levels of Prevotella. They also do not have these chronic non-infectious diseases that we have the epidemic, and certainly this change happens if somebody from these places in the world with a high abundance of this healthy organism, it will change rapidly within a few months to come to this unhealthy Western pattern. So you can understand this in some ways as the increasing dietary stress load. So we know we all have experienced an increased psychological stress load. So when these two come together, as they do in our Western lifestyle, they obviously have a detrimental effect on our brain gut microbiome axis and our health overall. Here's just a few things about how stress interacts with you. You may not think that it does much to your microbes, but it actually, the brain through its autonomic nervous system can talk, for example, with its main neurotransmitter, norepinephrine, directly to receptors on many microbes, which changes their gene expression and their behavior. And then they can change their behavior towards the host, towards our gut. And this is probably the case for many other microbes and neurotransmitters as well, that stress mediators like serotonin, I showed you before, can change then the function of the microbes. Stress also does a lot of things that fundamentally change the habitat of where the microbes live in. So the contractions, the transit of contents through the gut, intestinal fluid secretion and mucus secretion, the function of these enteroendocrine cells we talked about, the epithelial and the blood-brain barrier can be influenced by chronic stress, and obviously the gut-associated immune system, either directly influence on the immune cells or indirectly through these microbial changes. So chronic stress plays, in my opinion, an almost equally important role in leading to this inappropriate immune system activation in our bodies as the unhealthy diet does. I think I'm going to skip through these. So the combined psychological and dietary stress load, allostatic load is, so this refers to a particular type of stress that becomes maladaptive to the organism. An acute stress response, can save you by running away or stimulating your immune system transiently from dying or getting killed. Chronic stress exposure causes this allostatic load, which is an increase in the negative effects of the stress. And this is associated with changes in the gut microbiome, chronic systemic immune activation, alteration in the metabolism, negative effects on many organ systems, structural and functional brain changes, and ultimately this epidemic of chronic non-infectious diseases. And here again is the list. I've shown this now several times, but I can't emphasize this enough. These are not really individual separate disease entities. This is a complex or an interconnected complex of diseases that we can relate to very similar causes, and diet and chronic stress playing a major role in these causes. Here again, so the increasing allostatic load shows us, when we look at our population and look at who lives in an optimal health state, which is symptomatically expressed as sensation of wellness or health, and how many people live in a disease state. So hard to believe that less than 5% actually live in an optimal health state, which would be the optimal diet, the healthy diet, and the absence of chronic stress, chronic negative exposure to chronic negative emotions. A large proportion lives in this suboptimal health state and a pre-disease state. So all the people that have these immune cell markers in their blood have a hemoglobin A1C that's just below the threshold of being pathological, that have an increased BMI, slightly increased BMI, they all fall into this category. So they're not optimally healthy than the pre-disease state. And only once they reached this clinical diagnostic threshold of disease, either because they have no symptoms or their doctor on a routine clinical checkup finds out that the blood sugar is elevated now, then they join this pool of almost half of the population of a disease state, which requires the healthcare system, including the pharmaceutical industry with their products, to stay alive and not die prematurely. Even though I hate to sort of simplify things as a scientist and make generalizations, but I do believe the big picture is it's the increasing allostatic load from mechanisms that we talked about throughout this talk that is a major driver. There have been people that are predicting that at least half of this population, this pre-disease population, could be eliminated with a healthy diet, for example, a largely plant-based diet. So because of the advanced time, I think I'm going to skip through some of these. Say a few words about the health benefits of a largely plant-based diet. So people that have paid attention to my presentation and didn't get too confused with all the scientific stuff in it will have realized that a largely plant-based diet will deliver components like these complex carbohydrates and the polyphenols that are essential for a healthy gut microbiome, and as a consequence for a healthy gut and anti-inflammatory effects, and basically a prevention of this negative consequence of steps towards a full-blown disease state. So I just picked here one because I'm most familiar with that traditional Mediterranean diet, but there's many other diets around the world, like the Okinawan diet, the traditional Chinese, traditional Japanese diet. So there's many other types of diets in the world that follow a similar course. So the majority of intake comes from fruits and vegetables, which provide a high diverse fiber, polyphenol, and antioxidant supply. Seafood products, mainly small fish, which have a higher concentration of these health-promoting omega-3 fatty acids. And importantly, a diet that is low in refined carbohydrates and ideally absent in absence of sugar. So if you compare the standard American diet, you could almost turn this pyramid upside down. Should not forget, very important part in the initial studies in the 60s of the health benefits of this diet has been noticed these close social interactions between people when they consume the diet that are reinforced by religious ties, traditional social ties, and many other well-studied functions. So it's not just the diet, it's also, as emphasized before, it's the mind. This wide-ranging beneficial reports about this Mediterranean diet for morbidity, mortality from many of these diseases, that these non-infectious chronic disease epidemic components. And well, many of these were sort of association studies that do not allow to comment on the causality of this diet in actually causing these or facilitating these diseases. There's now several new studies have come out that indeed confirm if somebody goes on that diet compared to somebody who continues to eat their standard American diet, they will have these benefits. Skip this. Something I do want to throw in here. So we talked about the fiber and the polyphenols. What comes out, and this is sort of my recommendation, if you want to follow a healthy diet, eat what your microbes benefit from. Everything else will be taken care of. The one thing is the fiber, there's excellent book that's come out recently by a friend and colleague of mine, Will Bulsiewicz, Fiber Fueled. I would highly recommend this. But polyphenols or antioxidants, thousands of molecules in plants. And the berries have gotten, the blueberries have gotten the most attention, but they're also in many other food items. They have been shown to be one of the main components of the health benefits of the diet. They have been originally identified as antioxidants because when you put these extracts from these fruits into cell cultures, they will have an antioxidant effect, but that's without going through the GI tract. Only 5 to 10% of these beneficial molecules are actually absorbed in the small intestine. Most of them go down to the gut microbiome, where they are broken down into smaller molecules, phenols that are being absorbed, that act both on other microbes, but that are reaching all our organs, including the brain, and have beneficial effects on a wide variety of organs. So it's really seems oversimplified. We don't have to worry about how much protein, how much fat, and how much carbohydrates we're eating. We're obsessed with those percentages. If we focus on eating enough that fulfills the needs of our gut microbiota, that will do the most for our not just gut health, but overall health. So I think I'm going to skip this to the end. So I think I'm going to stop with this. So sort of the last chapter in my book, the One Health concept. So there's clearly very intricate connections between our diet, our individual health, our gut health, our brain health, and planetary health. A largely plant-based diet, it doesn't have to be vegan or vegetarian, is obviously the optimal diet for our individual health, for gut health, for anti-inflammation, but also the consequences it has for example, of environmental interventions that we have done just to increase the production of red meat, cutting down the Amazon rainforest, the greenhouse gases generated by these animals, and many other concepts, the transport of these animals around the world. If we eliminate this, so people have predicted this, we could rapidly change several things that are wrong with our individual health and crises like climate change. And in the middle of all this is our gut microbiome and how it interacts with our immune system. let me go to the last, sorry for this. Another way of this One Health concept is clearly to understand coming to an ecological view of health, with the microbes and the immune system being a major connecting component of connecting these various systems together. So if you want to read more about this, particularly the last parts about the One Health concepts and the various implications, I didn't talk about soil health and soil microbiome, which is also very much linked to this One Health concept. So you can either go to my website, where you find the regularly updated content about these topics, sign up for our bi-weekly Mind-Gut Connection newsletter, or if you can't wait and want to get a discount on your pre-publication order, go to the local bookstore and order the Gut Immune Connection. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great, thank you. We have so many questions, and so there's no chance that we're going to get to all of them, and some of them are fairly specific. So if you have a specific question about your own physical situation, I may not get to that, but I'll try and hit as many questions as I can. So the first question I want to get to is one that is close to my heart. So did I hear you say that chocolate is good for us?
Yeah, I mean, this is a whole, you could write a book about chocolate, and I think books have been written about it. There's definitely a component, cacao part of the chocolate before all the fat and the sugar is being added, that is very rich, very high concentration of these polyphenols, of flavonoids, which is one health benefit. The other benefit is on stimulating certain microbes that I showed you to produce more serotonin. Yes, it definitely is a healthy thing to eat. I eat a tablespoonful every morning.
Well, that's good. We got that out of the way. So thank you. So lots of questions about how one might be able to test one's own microbiome. Like, is there an ideal gut microbiome? There are some over-the-counter, I suppose, companies that sell tests. Are those legit? What are they looking for? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Very difficult topic to comment on. Yes, there are several commercial suppliers of that information, of these tests. If you just want to know, what type of main microbial families and phyla you have in your gut, you can go to the American Gut Project website, and they will do a very unbiased, uncommercial way of providing you with information, and compares you to the standard American population, which is not a healthy population. So this is always the problem that I have with this. If you assume that from what I told you about the state of health that we have in the West, this is not a normal state of. But some people like that. When I recommended they come back with this report, they want to have the explanation. I always tell them this is not an actionable information. You cannot, and the people that are behind this, like Rob Knight, pioneer in this field, makes it abundantly clear this is not actionable information that will change, will make specific changes. So then there's a lot of commercial entities that analyze the relative abundances of your various microbes and give you very specific information. I generally, when patients come with those reports, I tell them that I really don't want to comment on this because it's not substantially validated or scientifically validated. And then there's there's one company now, Viome, it's based in Seattle, that uses a very sophisticated analysis, both in terms of analyzing what the genes transcribe, these microbial genes, and also they, propose that they use artificial intelligence on their hundreds of thousands of samples to make customized, personalized recommendations. Until the scientific data on these recommendations is out in well-controlled randomized studies, I would tell my patients it's better to stick with a general plant-based diet. If there are certain things in that diet that don't agree with you, you can eliminate those. But the standard diet is still the best for probably the majority of humans on this planet.
We have a couple specific questions about food, so I'm going to get to those now and then ask some more questions about some of the science in a moment. We've heard on advertisements and whatnot about fermented foods being particularly good for your health, your gut microbiome. Is that true?
Well, there's a long history. People have in human history fermented foods for tens of thousands of years, many to preserve them. So early humans did not do that to do something for their gut health. But certainly there's been enough time that our gut microbes and our immune system have adapted genetically, or so usually you think about 10, 15,000 years it takes before genes adapt to a new environmental situation. So my feeling is that there have been an adaptation to have these external microbes added to your internal microbes. And in some patients, they actually colonize your microbiome. In most of the cases, they disappear within 24 or 48 hours. So in this area, my recommendation is, yes, I would add fermented foods to your diet on a regular basis. Ideally in the form of naturally fermented foods, ranging from yogurt to kefir to small amounts of cheeses. There's hundreds of different microorganisms on different French cheeses, for example, right? Maybe thousands. They're typically in the rind of the cheese, so not in the center. And so maybe that's the reason that the French can eat quite an unhealthy diet, but don't die prematurely, because they constantly add this population of health promoting microbes. It's just a pure guess, but so yes, I would say it's a good idea to add, even though we don't have that really clear-cut scientific evidence. A few studies have even shown that it may not only be good to add to add probiotics to your diet, for example, after an antibiotic treatment, because it might prolong the time it takes for your own microbiome to come back. But there's very few well-controlled studies to sort of support that.
Let me repeat that, because there was a question specifically about antibiotic. If you have to take a wide spectrum antibiotic, should you take, is it probiotics or prebiotics to help repopulate? And what I think I heard you just say is that it's not, there's no scientific evidence of doing that, and in fact that might slow down your body's own. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was one study out of the Weizmann Institute in Israel that showed that. Very controversial study, even on a very credible group, one of the best groups in this field, been heavily criticized. But that study did not rule out that if you are on a broad spectrum antibiotic and you increase the amount of yogurt and fermented foods that you eat, that's harmful. I would actually do that myself and have done this myself. Fortunately, I never have gone through prolonged periods of antibiotics, but I would do it myself, quite honestly. It just somehow makes sense. But popping, all kinds of supplements with all kinds of probiotics, I don't think that that's something I would do, but not a very scientific answer. Sorry.
Well, and then you get into the whole issue of whether supplements not being regulated in the same way that medications are, and are the ingredients in the supplements actually in that they list? Are they actually in there? Anyway,
Yeah, the
so
whole supplement story is you know, I always debate this with our son. Um, it's obviously a lot of people make a lot of money with supplements. You know, it's if you're a functional medicine practitioner, um, your main income doesn't come from procedures like, you know, for a gastroenterologist or a cardiologist. It comes from prescribing supplements, and some of these supplements are actually quite expensive. Some people I know have become multimillionaires with selling supplements, some physicians. And yeah, so this is supplements are not going to go away. You know, even if somebody did a controlled study, they will not go away because it's. I don't want to say anything negative about them, but also I don't. For me personally, as a scientist and physician, I would go with the natural products. You know, that as a preferred recommendation.
there, I think you mentioned something about this briefly, and there was a question about this. I've heard something about how babies who are born by C-section have a different microbiome in their gut than babies that are born vaginally. And can you talk about that and what that means?
Yeah, so I mean, there's obviously been an increase, quite a dramatic increase in some parts of the world, like Italy or Brazil, the number of C-sections. And this received a lot of attention initially because people found that, you know, there were definitely changes in the gut microbiome, and this whole idea that the first colonization of the gut microbiome comes when the baby goes through the birth canal and gets exposed to both fecal and vaginal microbes. Sort of fascinating stories. But then when you look at this a year later, you know, the most of these infants have caught up with the vaginal born ones. So this, at the same time, however, there are studies that this has an effect, even this relatively transient time of not having the full spectrum of the maternal microbiome on an increased risk for asthma. I think it's mainly asthma. I don't remember if it's also for obesity, but this definitely has a negative, demonstrated negative effect on some autoimmune processes. There's also discussions. So we didn't talk at all about the, you know, the dramatic increase in autoimmune diseases like inflammatory bowel disease or allergies, all of which also point towards this interaction with you know, of the microbes, the early development of the microbes based on lifestyle factors and medications that we expose them to.
What about folks who have had a gastric bypass surgery?
Yeah, so there has been quite a few studies. So with one of my colleagues has done one of these studies for like bariatric surgeries, and there's definitely several interesting things happening. So the microbes changed, maybe due, in fact, and partially due to the change in diet. So people after bypass surgery dramatically change their diet, at least for a while. So these microbial changes sort of revert back to a pre-surgical state in part. But there's also dramatic changes, for example, in the craving for certain foods, particularly unhealthy foods, which happens very rapidly after the surgery. And it almost implies there have to be signals from the gut, either the gut alone or the gut microbial interactions that reach the brain that you know, turn off some of these centers that regulate craving, like the whole, you know, reward system or the hypothalamus. So yeah, so there's definitely significant impact on that surgery transiently, and I'm not aware of the results of long-term follow-up of these studies. So some people do not gain back their weight. Our prediction always has been that they're the ones that maintain some of these microbial changes, where others, bounce back and have sometimes even a yo-yo effect. They gain more weight after the surgery. If that is related primarily to the microbes, I can't answer that question right now.
Question about, has there ever been an attempt to engineer drugs that act specifically on the microbiome of the in the body for the nervous system? Because I assume that like a SSRI affects serotonin, which is, there's a lot in the gut, but is there anything that like is specifically towards the microbiome?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I mean, it's there are ongoing attempts to manipulate or bioengineer microbes, to produce substances that are beneficial to us. Like, for example, short-chain fatty acids. So you would have hyperproducers of short-chain fatty acids, and so people are working on that. People have also worked on GABA producing microbes. We have some of those, but to increase the concentration of GABA, it reaches high enough concentrations to have anxiolytic effects. So there's many of these attempts. When you go to one of these startup meetings, there's quite a few companies and a lot of money going into that concept. Let's take advantage of what we know so far and enhance the positive effects or decrease, knock out the negative effects. So, for example, you can do that. There's now studies. So Michael Fischbach, for example, from Stanford, he's able to identify a particular gene in a particular microbe that's responsible for one of these indole metabolites that with the negative effects on various brain diseases. I wouldn't be surprised if in the future approaches like that, once we know exactly what those genes are and what happens in a mouse model, that it's compatible with health, that we will see studies on these kind of compounds. So more, to answer your question, more modifications on the microbes themselves than on medications. We don't really know. I mean, there's a lot of fascinating interactions of medications, Parkinson's medications, for example, with certain microbes to enhance the plasma levels of dopamine precursors that can be absorbed in the brain. So there's very interesting components, or also, for example, changing certain microbes, increasing the abundance of microbes that use that can metabolize lactic acid to enhance physical performance, change lactic acid into short-chain fatty acids. So yeah, there's almost an unlimited possibilities given, the 2 to 20 million genes that these microbes have, that there's a lot of them that can be manipulated. And when we're going to get to that point that we can do this without risking very serious, totally unanticipated side effects, because we know so little about the system yet. That's the other question. It's like introducing rabbits to Australia, without knowing what the ecosystem there was before the introduction. And so,
yeah, unintended consequences. One more question about, actually, I have two more questions about things that people can do themselves, or food that they can choose, or otherwise. So I heard you mention tofu a couple of times early, and then there was a question about things like plant milks or plant meat substitutes. Those are plant-based, but they're highly processed. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, it's another very interesting topic. I could talk a long time about this. So clearly switching to plant sources for these foods that we all love, but we know now, have negative health consequences or pro-inflammatory. certainly these plant-based substitutes have a beneficial effect on the planetary side of this One Health concept. So there's fewer animals, uh, dairy cows, with all the, I mean, I didn't mention this at all during this talk, with all the ethical concerns that people have, including myself, about many of these methods that we use to produce our animal-based food. What we don't know yet, and you said the key word is ultra-processed foods. So the dairy products, so the milk substitutes, yes, they are more processed, but it's nothing compared to the plant-based burger or the Impossible Burger that have 18 ingredients. You don't even know exactly what all happens to these foods, and wouldn't it be just much better to just get used to a veggie burger? Because even for the personal health, it's been calculated. If you add all the ingredients that come with that Impossible Burger, so the French fries and the mayo and the ketchup and whatever else comes with these meals, and the extra large Coke, then you come up almost with the same amount of unhealthy calories as you have with a beef-based burger. So I don't think the last word on this is out yet. These are very popular products. I think there may be, I've read that even in meat-loving countries like Argentina and Brazil, they're have increased dramatically the popularity. So there's a possibility that this may contribute to saving the rainforest. So I don't want to say just negative things about it, but I think it has a lot of, for those people that promote a plant-based diet, I've talked to several, they're not in favor of that. Foods should not be ultra-processed.
Interesting. So I realize that there are a lot of variables around this question, but if somebody were to change to a largely plant-based diet and follow some of the guidelines that you are talking about, what kind of changes would they see, or how long would it take to notice something in their own bodies?
Yeah, so well, so if you're part of a study, or if your primary care physician looks at your hemoglobin A1C, or just your whole metabolic health, your cholesterol levels, then you would see that fairly quickly, and you would probably also, because then the caloric density of this food is much lower, unless, this is always the big problem, unless you add all these sauces and fatty things to your plant-based food. Obviously you will not see these benefits, because you just get them in a different form. But I would say, if somebody follows that strictly, and something has not come up, I don't know, amongst these many questions that you have, is, so there's this other modification that involves the dietary modification that involves the gut microbiome, which is this time-restricted eating and intermittent fasting. That certainly you can test out yourself. And in our family, we've done it during the pandemic. I've talked to many people that have done it as well. I personally don't think it's realistic to stick with truly intermittent fasting, not eating for 2 days during the week. If you're working and if you have a routine, and if a family see your children eat normally, and your wife, and you don't eat anything for 2 days. But I think the time-restricted eating is something much more realistic. Still takes some discipline, but compressing the time when you eat to 8 hours, and leave the gut microbes alone for themselves for 16 hours without adding external food to them. You can definitely observe this on your weight if you weigh yourself every day. And also, many studies have looked at the parameters of metabolic health. So combining a largely plant-based diet with this time-restricted eating is something that I've recommended in my book, and I think that's something everybody can really try out for themselves.
Okay, and as I mentioned before, I'm going to ask you my final question, which is something that I have been asking many of our speakers at our events. As I mentioned at the beginning, my goal for these events is to make science interesting and compelling for adults, and because I think that especially now, science literacy is so important. But why do you feel like it's important for people to learn about science?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and what happened to me after I wrote my first book. So I was totally immersed in attending, Society of Neuroscience conferences and being meetings, spending more time on the road, on planes, in airports and meetings than at home. So I was satisfied just to talking to my colleagues, and driving my own career. After I wrote this book and I got the feedback from, literally thousands of people that are interested in this, and also then saw what's out there on non-evidence-based information by people that essentially just want to make money with some new fad diet, or I sort of coined this term fake science, which is often heavily promoted by the media, unfortunately. Even science writers like to write sensational stories. So something is found in a mouse, and then the science writer would write, now we're closer, one step closer to curing such and such a disease, which, having worked with animal models, I know exactly how far it is from a mouse to a human disease, treating a human disease. So I got really ambitious and become almost my main mission now. So I wrote my second book, to deliver science to the lay audience, or to the educated lay audience. It's another story to take it to people that have either are opposed to science or just have no interest in it. But my target audience has become people, interestingly enough, women from 40 to 70 years old who are somehow either involved in diet-related professions, or so a very specific section of the population. And so I've made this my main mission now to, with all these opportunities that come with writing a book, to promote this, just like this event that you've organized. I think that's become the most important part of my career at this stage, and I think it's partially successful. So I have a few colleagues now in the same wavelength. We're doing this exactly the same thing. We're thinking about potentially forming a group or an organization that will do exactly that from our public platforms. So,
Well, great. We should talk afterward because I have some thoughts. But I've kept you a little bit long. I want to say thank you to Dr. Emmerin Meyer for your talk. Very interesting. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions, but thank you for being here this evening.
it was a pleasure. So I'll have my well-deserved drink in the in the
Yeah,
lobby.
great. And thank you to all of you for coming. And I am going to share my screen again and remind you that if you are interested in purchasing either one or both of the books, that you can go to Broadway Books here in Portland, and they will give you a 15% discount, which I believe that the volunteers can put in the chat again. Also, we here at Science on Tap, this is a labor of love for us, and we are trying to bring science to as many people as possible, and we need your help. So if you enjoyed this evening and you want to help keep events going, we would appreciate anything that you might be able to donate. So you can Make You Think is our nonprofit partner, and you can make a tax-deductible donation through Make You Think, or if, as I mentioned before, if you wanted to join our Patreon at certain levels, I'll send you a Science on Tap pint glass or various other things. So anyway, keep those in mind, and we're appreciative of anything that you can offer. So thank you. Next event, we're going to be talking on Thursday, April 29, with Michelle Nyhouse. And she's going to be talking about her book, Beloved Beasts, Fighting for Life in the Age of Extinction. And she is an acclaimed science journalist and actually local here to the Portland, greater Portland, Pacific Northwest area. So should be a fun event, and has been to many of our events, might be out there right now. Also, as I've mentioned Patreon a couple of times. These are the some of the 128 folks who are Patreon supporters. These are the folks who are donating $10 or more. Thank you to all of you, and just wanted, you are helping keep this going. So thanks. And with that, I'm going to leave this slide up there if you feel compelled. We will also be sending out a survey in an email in a little while that you can give us some feedback on what you think about tonight. And you can also sign up to be on Dr. Meyer's mailing list. And yeah, hopefully you'll let us know what you think. So thank you all for coming. Have a great evening, and come back and see us at the end of the month to learn about Beloved Beasts.